Well, we've been saying at each of our sessions, and I'll repeat it again in case any of you have already been to the first two today and heard this, it's from the heart. We are so appreciative of our readers and so appreciative of our angels and for your generosity in buying the tickets, which are not inexpensive, and they really fuel this Writers Fest. We started this in 2014 in this library. The brainstorm was at Tamara's Country Club in 2013. And our mission was exactly what's happening here now and has for 6 years. It's basically an ideas festival built around very smart authors and very good books. And we lean nonfiction for a very specific reason, because we think that's more bluntly educational. Sure, we do novelists, and they are more than welcome, and you've attended many meetings here with novelists, but our nonfiction component really drives this. And it's our pleasure today to welcome Mark Updegrove, who is brilliant and has written, and we were chatting. I wish we could have that photo back up here of the book cover. It doesn't happen to be there, does it? This photo was really fueling our chat over here, because this photo shows two men that are both so similar, a generation apart, deeply loving and respecting each other, and now it seems like that's another era. Mm-hmm. Is that fair to say, Mark?
Well, I think it's called The Last Republicans for a reason. Certainly the Republican Party has entered in. Well, first of all, thank you so much for coming out today, and what an honor it is to be here. I'm delighted to talk to you all and to meet David. So thanks so much for your time today. But we have clearly entered into a new age politically, and the Republican Party is a very different party than it was for George H.W. Bush when he was standard bearer, and for his son George W. Bush when he was standard bearer. And I think that one of the things I write about in the book is this core set of values, this ethos that comes from the Bush family. And David and I were talking about this earlier. We'll probably talk about George H.W. Bush's funeral and the outpouring of love around this man who was not necessarily appreciated when he was in office. But that ethos is really about decency, about civility, about giving back to one's country. And those are things that we don't talk about a lot today. We don't talk about the greater good. One of the things that George W. Bush talks about often is that when he was in office, he was guided by the biblical notion of to whom much is given, much is required. And that informed a lot of his foreign policy, whether you agreed with it or not. And again, that's not something that we talk about in America today. You had George H.W. Bush campaigning under the platform of giving us a kinder, gentler nation. You had George W. Bush campaigning as a compassionate conservatism. We don't hear about kindness and gentleness. We don't hear about compassion in today's political discourse. I think it's sorely lacking, and so in that respect, David, we very much entered into a new era.
Well, it feels as if, and probably a silly word because it's better to state that I think that we've entered, obviously, the Trump era, but more importantly, it's an era of let's take off the gloves, let's win, let's develop some nationalism, national spirit, and let's see where this new Republican Party will go. I don't think you had mentioned ideology in here. I don't think there is a Republican ideology at this time. I think there's a very clear Democratic ideology, which is left, leaning left, moving left, rushing left, and leadership left. So I think it's definable. But I don't think the Republican Party has a definable ideology at this time. And I'm not sure that these gentlemen had a definable ideology. They were, for lack of a better term by a layman, I think they were country club Republicans.
Well, in some respects, George H.W. Bush was considered a country club Republican. And of course, that was the set that ran the Republican Party for so long. And when George H.W. Bush achieved the presidency in the wake of Ronald Reagan's 2 terms in office, he was regarded warily by the conservatives, who had really, in so many ways, taken over the party and directed party ideology. I think he was accused of not having strong ideological leanings. And he was a pragmatist. But frankly, and I think we saw this in the appreciation of George H.W. Bush that came out after his death, This is the right guy in office at the right time for so many reasons. Because he was a pragmatist, because he wasn't an ideologue. And one of the things that he is getting due credit for, which is richly deserved in my view, is, and John Meacham mentioned this last night, is that the Cold War ended without a shot being fired, without tanks in the streets. That is a remarkable accomplishment given where we were. And part of the reason for that was that you had George H.W. Bush, this very humble, very practical pragmatist, also a great diplomat. And he realizes that if he, at least figuratively, dances on the wall like an ideologue would, proclaiming the victory of American values over Soviet totalitarianism, it would have compromised Gorbachev's leadership, and it would have emboldened the hardliners to rise up and take him out and bring the Soviet Union back, at least for a time. It would have also hindered Bush's ability to negotiate with Gorbachev in the wake of the Soviet Union's collapse. So in so many ways, I think George H.W. Bush, while not a pronounced ideologue, was the right guy to have in office from 1989 to 1993.
Did the Read My Lips, no new taxes, actually cost him the election, or did James Carville constantly saying it's the economy stupid, or are they really united? Are they one machine against H.W. Bush, or are they two separate?
No, I think those are the same things, David. You were on to something. Do you all remember that when, of course, George H.W. Bush, when he was campaigning for the presidency, said, people will urge me to raise taxes. They'll try to encourage me to do that, but I'll say, read my lips, no new taxes. He was doing that because the Grover Norquists of the world were rising up along with this conservative movement saying, we don't really trust you, George Bush, and we're expecting that you're not going to raise taxes. And he really had to hold the line on that, David. He really had to, in order to get the nomination and the support of reluctant conservative Republicans, he had to make those promises. But in 1990, in order to get a budget passed, he capitulated. And it was the right thing to do for a variety of reasons. And economists will now tell you that the unprecedented prosperity that we enjoyed during the Clinton era was a direct result of those tax increases in 1990. So actually the John F. Kennedy Foundation gave its Profile in Courage Award to George H.W. Bush for the courage of having made that decision. But the conservatives who were wary of Bush to begin with finally said, well, he really is a moderate, and they moved away from him in 1992. And that, along with James Carville saying it's the economy, stupid, and dwelling on that message, resulted in Bush 41's undoing.
What was the election result in '92? What was the percentage? Clinton versus, we had Perot. Perot was
right.
19%, I think, right?
And you all think about Perot now because of the thing with Howard Schultz, right?
Howard Schultz looks like the reincarnation of a weird reincarnation, a coffee-drinking reincarnation.
Well, it seemed like that Perot, if you remember, drank a whole lot of coffee. He was certainly caffeinated.
That's right.
In 1992. The election result, it was 37% George Bush, 19% Ross Perot, 43% Bill Clinton. But it would have been listen, I've talked to a lot of people in the Bush camp, including James Baker, and they will tell you it would have been virtually impossible to stop Bill Clinton in 1992. He was this indomitable force and represented a new generation, and I think that the American electorate gets caught up in that, just in the same way that we did with John F. Kennedy in 1960, taking over for Dwight Eisenhower. We had a brand new generation. The torch has been passed to a new generation. So that's intoxifying to a certain degree. But also, we had 12 years of Republican rule at that point, 2 years of Ronald Reagan and 4 years of George Bush. And we like balance in this country. We like to exercise our own lever in the checks and balance system, and we do that by voting. So you don't often see a Republican administration followed by another Republican administration.
It was very low
Or Democrat.
very low turnout, though, Mark, 92
was.
and 96. Very low turnout.
was.
When you compare that to today, the percentage of people voting, today what I see ginning up is a remarkable getting people registered and getting them to the polls. This is a new era, and this will probably guarantee Democrat victories for an awfully long time, I think, by just sheer demographics. Let's talk about W43 for a moment. Yes, not a country club Republican, but very much enamored by his father's powerful presence in his life, his devotion to his father, etc. But really kind of a firebrand and heavy drinker for a while, and kind of a wildcatter in Texas. I mean, almost an oil wildcatter, wasn't he?
Yeah, he was.
And then a baseball team owner. Boy, that's a sweet deal.
It's a fascinating evolution, and one of the things that George W. Bush doesn't get credit for is he is incredibly disciplined. Far, far smarter than you would expect. I mean, he almost played that down. He spent his life climbing the political ranks, partly by managing expectations. Remember when he was on the campaign trail in 2000, he would ask people to stow their expectations, just as you would stowing your luggage. He said, or else they can fall out and hit me on the head and disappoint you. So stow your expectations, he would say. But this is a person who is enormously intelligent, has a capacious mind, intellectually curious. These are all things that we didn't think about him when he was in the White House. How many of you all were there last night? Were any of you? You heard that last night, how much we get it wrong in the moment. It's astounding to me as an historian that we will scrutinize a president to the nth degree and yet get the story so profoundly wrong. And that is what makes it a pleasure for someone like me, a historian, to go back and set the record straight. But that was certainly the case with the Bushes. There was, I'll just take it, if I may, about the impetus of the book, David, which is there was this conventional wisdom that sprang up around the two Bushes when George W. Bush became president, about the old man and how much influence he had on George W. Bush, how much how disappointed he was when George W. Bush waged the Iraq War, how much he was trying to send messages to his son through doing various things, how they were competing for their places in history. All that stuff is absolutely ludicrous. And one of the myths around George W. Bush, going back before he became president, was that he was this undisciplined guy who never made much of himself. There is some truth to that story. He drank an awful lot before he was 40 by his own admission. And on the threshold of middle age, just in his 40th year, he put down the bottle and took up the Bible. And it changed his life. He quit drinking cold turkey. Again, speaking to the discipline of George W. Bush. He didn't have any 12 steps. He didn't have meetings in church basements. He just decided one day that he had drank too much and stopped drinking, period. That was the end of that. At the same time, he had been introduced to religion, and it speaks to his rarefied background, to the privilege in which he grew up, that he was introduced to it by Billy Graham at in Kennebunkport, Maine. And on Walker's Point, he had been a guest of Vice President and Mrs. Bush, and they struck up a relationship. And Billy Graham gave George W. Bush a Bible. That's like Babe Ruth giving you a bat. It's amazing. And he started reading it, and it spoke to him. And he will tell you that his father was his most profound influence in his first 4 decades of life, and Jesus Christ became his primary influence from then until now. So he did have a wild, misspent youth. I think no more so than a lot of people were really living the 60s. But he amended his ways and put himself on a different course.
We learned last year from Karl Rove at our Writers' Fest that Karl Rove and George W. Bush had a reading contest for a year.
Yeah.
And they battled it out as to how many books each could read, and they would compare notes. They'd chat a couple of times a week And Rove would say, I'm at 48. Where are you, Mr. President? And George W. would say, I'm at 47 and catching up. And I think it was neck and neck. And I think that George W. Bush read more books that year than Karl Rove, which absolutely defies the sort of the media presentation of W. during his presidency, which was one step removed from Gerald Ford bumping his head on the helicopter door. I mean, it was just like, well, he's not so bright and he's roaming around and he happens to have the world's most important job. But apparently his intelligence was legit, and he's the only president, courtesy of your book, he's the only president that we've ever had with an MBA. Mm-hmm. And I think does that surprise our readers? W had an MBA from Harvard. From Harvard. He sort of applied on a whim and knocked it off and ended up with an MBA.
Yeah, and you know, again, your comparison to Gerald Ford is interesting. Gerald Ford was looked upon as a dim-witted clod, a dimwit who graduated from Yale Law School, a clod who was perhaps the best athlete we've ever had in the White House. How can we get it so profoundly wrong? And in the same way, Bush was looked at as being an intellectual lightweight who was trading in on his father's name. And he wasn't the heir apparent to the Bush dynasty. It was really who? Yeah, well, that's not true either. George W. Bush had run for Congress in 1978. There's a quaint tradition among the Bushes in politics where you lose your first race. And you learn from that race and take that knowledge and win your next go-around. And George W. Bush adhered to that tradition. He ran a very credible, impressive race for Congress in West Texas in 1978. Won the Republican nomination against all odds and ran a very tight race against his opponent, who effectively painted him as a carpetbagger. In fact, he used to have this joke. His opponent would talk about, he was very Texan, very folksy, very country. And he would say that, the other day I was out by my ranch and this limousine came down and the window descended. This guy popped out and he said, can you tell me where the Phillips Ranch is? And he said, yeah, well, you go down about 2 miles and you take a right after the cattle guard. The window starts to go up and then it goes back down. And the gentleman pops his head back out and he says, can you tell me what color uniform that cattle guard will be wearing? In West Texas, you know that a cattle guard is one of those things on the road that prevents the cattle from crossing the road. And then he would end the joke with, and then that limousine drove off, and I was sure it had Connecticut license plates.
Oh, boy.
So George W. Bush vowed never to be out-countryed again, but he ran a darn impressive race and showed himself to be a cannier politician than his father was. And his father admitted that. So when he ran for office in 1994, this myth springs up because both of the Bushes, Jeb and George W., were vying for the governorships of their states, Texas and Florida, respectively. It was thought that Jeb would win in a walk. He was going against an opponent who was very weak at the time, just not doing particularly well in the polls and was vulnerable. George W. Bush, on the other hand, was contending against Ann Richards, who had an approval rating of 64%. So even his mother said, George, you can't win. Not because she didn't have faith in him, but because she had been a student of the political process. And she saw a very popular incumbent. So that gives rise to this myth that the Bushes believed that Jeb was the guy and not George W. And I think that they were largely agnostic. They just were pleased that their sons were continuing the political tradition, which is so, I think the Bushes believe that getting involved in public service is the most honest reflection of patriotism. And they were very pleased that their sons had entered into the political ring.
And Ann Richards said of George H.W. Bush, he was born with a silver foot in his mouth. Remember that? That was, yeah. She made hay with that. I mean, that was replayed thousands of times.
Yeah,
That
it's a
was
great line, too.
Yeah, it was a media moment that just lived on and on and on.
Yeah.
So that Bush victory was a surprise, and Jeb did not win.
Jeb didn't win.
As to running and losing, this is seemingly irrelevant, but Jimmy Carter ran for the Plains Public Library Board in Plains, Georgia, and he lost. That was his first election, and he lost.
That's right.
Yeah, I mean, that's,
And if you've
so
seen
it's
Plains,
important to lose, yeah.
Plains, Georgia, population 640.
Yeah. He ran a lousy campaign.
Yeah.
And he didn't have a library like this either, by the way. And back to the reverence now for the, and I think that word is applicable to both Bushes, but particularly George H.W. Bush. We saw that in the funeral. We saw that in the length of that, the honoring, the outpouring, Bob Dole standing from his wheelchair. We saw so many things with that coverage. How else do we see anything? And really very moving, and really, I think, very legitimate and very honest, but and reverence. But as far as W goes, when he was president in 2006, I was looking at the reviews of a film, Death of a President, which was a documentary made for HBO. And it actually showed in theaters and then on HBO. This was a documentary that depicted the assassination of George W. Bush. So things were pretty rough then, too, as far as, I mean, we see that with Trump and more than I guess we've ever seen it before. But it was pretty rough then, too, in 2006, to have had that movie made.
No question about that. Look, it's easy to look back and think that there was a more innocent and simpler time, and we tend to do that. For folks, David and I were just talking about this. I teach at the University of Texas, and occasionally I have a student come to me frequently to my office, and they will say, "Has it ever been this bad? Have we ever been this divided before?" And I'll say, "Look, no one's firing on Fort Sumter, right? No one's getting beat to a pulp on the floor of the House of Representatives.
With a cane.
With a cane. With a cane. Yes, we are in a difficult state right now. We are very polarized. We are extraordinarily divided. But if you look back in history, it should give us comfort that we go through tumult, we go through tempest, and we get through it. If we honor our institutions and our values, if we get back to those things, we understand who we are, and it allows us to get through those tough times.
I think there was a broad notion afoot in the Republican Party of George W. Bush and I think the attacks were pretty fierce, as you're saying, and certainly that movie was part of that he just didn't seem to fight back. I mean, the gloves were always on, and he was going to say, this goes with the office, or this kind of really visceral and cruel and really agitated public hatred of him, probably mostly from the Iraq War, I'm guessing. But he didn't seem to fight back. And maybe historically that'll be treated as that's how a gentleman reacts.
It's interesting you say this. I'm interviewing him on Tuesday in Austin. He's doing something for the university system and for about 500 people, and I'm doing an interview. And I was going to ask him about the press to get his view on the media, whether the media's changed markedly since he was president. But in doing this, in figuring out the question I was going to ask him, David, I was looking at some of the things that he had said about the press during the latter parts of his presidency, at a point when he was being absolutely eviscerated by the press, by the Hollywood community, by so many. And I can't believe how gracious he was at the time. I wish I had those quotes to read to you, but I was amazed at how he would commend them for doing their jobs. He would commend them for the scrutiny that they were giving him, knowing that they were simply doing their jobs. That's one of the levers in the checks and balances that we have. They are the fourth estate. We have these checks and balances in our government. You've heard the legislative, the judicial, and the executive checks and balances that we have, but we also have the press. And he realizes that they're doing their jobs. When he heard, when he was asked on the Today Show in 2017, soon after Donald Trump became president, about Donald Trump's remarks that the press was the enemy of the people, he said, no. they're doing what they need to do. The press is in place to hold people like me to account. So he respected what they were doing, even if it didn't reflect well on him. And I don't think it's just being a gentleman. That's being an American.
It was certainly a change since then. But I think that change has been building in the Republican Party. I really do. I mean, Nixon exhibited it when you won't have Nixon to kick
Nixon
around
to kick around
anymore.
anymore, yeah.
And when he took Ron Ziegler, that famous moment, coming off a statement during the height of the Watergate fury, and the press was just full bore at him, almost physically coming. And he took Ron Ziegler and turned him around and shoved him and said, "You talk to them." That was a moment where you began to see this hostility that it would really boil over now and then. And now it's boiling over. It's all over. It's out of the pot, into the burners, and down the front of the kitchen range. So it's really going now.
There's no question about that. John Meacham talked yesterday about George H.W. Bush having an audio diary. He would tape himself, and he would record his thoughts contemporaneously about what was happening at that time. And it's invaluable for an historian to have that. That's a treasure trove of history. If you can get into the mind of your president contemporaneously. At the Johnson Library, for instance, which I was the director of for many years, we have the taped telephone conversations of LBJ doing the business of his presidency. And they're fascinating. They give you just such an amazing glimpse. In fact, I'm doing a session on this tomorrow. I'd love to have you there. But the interesting thing about that those tape diaries of George Bush is that he was using them in order to vent to a certain extent. He was using them sometimes he would be a little petulant on them, and he would complain. There is intense scrutiny that you have as a president, and you need an outlet. But to Harry Truman's point, if you can't stand the heat, get out of the kitchen. Well, don't sign up for the presidency if you don't think there won't be intense scrutiny, and it won't all come back to you. That's part of the job. And one of the things that helped George W. Bush, and one of the reasons I wanted to write this book, is his dad. That relationship between him and his dad came to bear in remarkable and unexpected ways when he was in office. He didn't need a taping system because he had his dad. And actually, there's a quote. Let me just read it from him. He said about his father, "It gave me comfort to talk to someone who knew what I was going through, to hear 'I love you.' Because of all the people in the country, he knew the pressure of the office. Nobody knows what you're going through, by the way. They just don't know. The most likely person, though, is someone who's been through what you've been through. If you've been president, you can see the stresses of the job. If you've been around a president, you can see the stresses of the job. And most of the conversations between us were those between father and son. Son, how you doing? Oh, Dad, I'm doing fine. A loving father who understands it's important to comfort during times of stress, to provide love in an environment that frankly isn't very loving at times, to be a listener. That's the crux of the role. Never before have there been conversations like this between two people who have been president, who love each other. So it wasn't about his dad saying, "Oh boy, you're getting it all wrong here in Iraq. You need to do this." What his dad really did was just offered a willing ear and was a loving presence in his life. And for a president, that's an invaluable asset to have.
Now, historically, the Bushes were the second father and son to hold the office. And don't forget, our nation was built on basically anti-royalty. We're not going to make the mistake that the English had. We're escaping that, and we're going to set up this brave new world. So can you talk just a little bit about the Adams situation?
Sure. The Adams situation is very different, David, because John Adams was, of course, our second president and left office in 1801, went to Quincy, Massachusetts to essentially political exile after his one-term presidency, which many considered failed at the time. It was the first time, the election of 1800 was the first time you pitted presidential candidates of two different parties against each other. Before that, we were all Federalists. And Thomas Jefferson begins the Republican Party and squares off against Federalist John Adams and wins the office. So he retreats to Quincy, Massachusetts. 24 years later, his son becomes president, takes up the office in 1825. So there's almost a quarter of a century that elapses between the administrations of the two men. And John Adams, who's in his last 14 months of life during the beginning of his son's presidency, is in faraway Quincy. They only saw each other. They only saw each other once during the course of John Quincy Adams' presidency, during the summer of 1825, and they spend a few days together. So he wasn't in a position to offer any immediate counsel or guidance to his son in the presidency. But George H.W. Bush was a spry 76 years old when George W. Bush becomes president in 2000, and was very much in the communications age, in a position to offer him guidance and support. So this is a relationship that very, very much had to be explored, because we may never have, to David's point, we're not a dynastic nation. We may never have another father-son president, or a father-daughter, or a mother-daughter, or any kind of combination between two generations.
So we won't likely have Bernie Sanders and then Bernie Sanders' son or anything like that.
Or Bernie Sanders' father.
Yeah, that's
the 120-year-old Mr. Sanders.
I'll tell you, that would be a trip, as they say. Now, as an historian, help us, please, Mark, with the time span between the end of a presidency, not the end of the life of a president, but the end of a presidency, and then how far along do you think it is fair, typical, et cetera, to begin the better analysis? Let's use Harry Truman. Harry Truman left, I think, pretty good terms with the American people. He is revered. I think that regardless of party, I think a lot of people say, oh, just bring back Harry Truman. And that's not sexist, and it's not that at all. It's Harry Truman, just plain talking, Midwesterner, don't spend a lot of money, and basically tell the truth and make rough decisions. So he's certainly been treated beautifully by history. George H.W. Bush, now we saw the outpouring. That's a very good treatment now historically. And I think W is on the verge of that, if not already in a bit of that. And he's pretty recent. I mean, you're talking now, what, 10 years?
Yeah.
And yet that clock seems to be moving faster, and I think Trump has driven that clock a little bit. But what is the historian's view of how long is a fair gap to really take a look at the president?
In my view, and I will come back to Harry Truman as an illustration of this. In my view, it takes at least a generation for us to look at a presidency in a balanced, even-handed way. Partly because it takes that long for passions to recede around that presidency. It takes a while for those visceral views that we have of a president to go away.
And are there different people looking in a generation?
Absolutely. Partly it's the Freedom of Information Act. Records have to be processed, in most cases, have to be processed after 24 years. So it takes that long for us to get the record, the historical record, out against for a president. Sometimes it takes more. I used to talk to George H.W. Bush about this, and I would say, I'm so pleased that you have seen in your lifetime a pretty accurate assessment of how you'll be seen in history. And he was vindicated, right? This is the guy who's bounced out of office in 1992 and feels like he has been absolutely repudiated. He thought he was serving honorably, but he felt he left office without, this is remarkable when you consider the funeral we just saw. He felt that Americans didn't know his heartbeat. Well, gosh, at the end of the day, when we remember George H.W. Bush, it's going to be all about heartbeat. More than anything else, I think, any single accomplishment of his presidency, he'll be remembered for his character, his sterling character, which was a model for his son. In Harry Truman's case, Harry Truman lived 20 years after leaving the presidency in 1953. He died in December of 1972, almost 20 years after leaving. And he got a chance to see that Americans were beginning to appreciate his character and the strength of character it took to make the most difficult decisions of his presidency. But he was helped after he died, in particular by David McCullough. Yeah. David McCullough did that voluminous 1,000-page, who's read that book? Look at that, it's amazing that many of you have read that book.
That's why they're here.
All right. Doug Brinkley was talking about that great Grant Wood Wood-like portrait on the front that shows the flinty Midwestern Harry Truman. And there was this new appreciation that we had for Truman. For Lyndon Johnson, which is a president near and dear to my heart, it took far longer than a generation to look at his administration in a balanced way. Because we remembered him for what? Vietnam. But I heard civil rights in there too. But at a certain, because the war had so divided us that it took that long, it took over 2 generations for those passions to recede and for that dark cloud of Vietnam to dissipate, to reveal the seminal laws of the Great Society which transformed this nation, including, and I heard it out there, civil rights. Ultimately, I think he left wanting to be remembered as the education president because he believed if you gave everyone a shot at a fair education, you wouldn't need civil rights. And he probably did more for education than any single president we've ever had. But he was remembered early on as being the Vietnam president. Ultimately, I think he'll be remembered not only for Vietnam, which is one pillar of his legacy, but for civil rights, which is the other pillar. But it took us an awful long time not to give credit, all the credit to John F. Kennedy, who did very little on civil rights, or others, and to show that it was Lyndon Johnson putting political capital on the line who made it happen.
Where is Johnson's place within the roster of presidents that you all vote on? Is it every 10 years, Mark?
Yeah, it's decennially, yeah.
Where you have the ranking. Is Johnson in ascendancy?
So there's the poll that David is referencing is a decennial poll that had begun by Arthur Schlesinger in 1948. So every 10 years, historians vote on the presidents, they rank them, and there are 5 categories. The quintiles are failure, below average, average, near great, and great. And the great presidents would be, shout them out, you know them all.
Abe Lincoln, George Washington,
you got
FDR.
It. That's the pantheon of the greats, right? And on that next level are the Dwight Eisenhowers, Harry Trumans, and now the Lyndon Johnsons. Lyndon Johnson is in that near great category, but for the Vietnam War would certainly be in the pantheon with Franklin Roosevelt, George Washington, and Abraham Lincoln.
Yeah. Remarkable. A couple of other things. This is going to be a little bit of a detour, but I happen to be a baseball fan. And if you could tell us, and you will so beautifully and succinctly, George Bush and the Texas Rangers.
George Bush realizes he wants to be a political force, but he realizes that he hasn't done anything in his life. There's nothing he can attach himself to as an accomplishment beyond being a Bush, the accident of birth and being born into a political family. His grandfather was a senator from Connecticut, and of course, his father had many posts, including vice president, when George W. Bush acquires the Texas Rangers. And he puts together this really canny deal where he gets a bunch of investors together to buy the Texas Rangers, which was this failing franchise, the Dallas, Texas Major League Baseball franchise. And he orchestrates the purchase and is really instrumental in building the team. He becomes general manager of the team, and it becomes this enormous business success. And Bush knows when that happens, he now has a platform in Texas to run for statewide office, and that's when he decides to take on Ann Richards for the governorship in 1994.
And his investment in the Texas Rangers was?
Very minimal, about $500,000. Very minimal, but it grows. But he got a disproportionate payoff when the franchise was sold because he had put the deal together and run the team.
And the team was sold for $250 million.
Yeah.
That's a good deal.
I think he made a cool, once that purchase went through, George W. Bush was wealthier than his dad, who had made an awful lot of money in the oil business.
And key to this, I think, Mark, not to belabor this for our non-baseball fans, but key to this was there was public funding for the ballpark at Arlington, which became really a beautiful little, they had played in a bandbox county stadium, which was a minor league park for years. I actually went to a couple of games there. And then they ended up with this really beautiful ballpark. which I think was heavily funded by a tax.
It's corporate welfare, you know,
Yeah.
and Bush had campaigned against that, and a lot of people thought he was hypocritical for accepting what people call corporate welfare to build this stadium. It ended up, I think, being beneficial economically to Dallas, Fort Worth, and Arlington, where the stadium sits. So it was a prudent investment on Arlington's part, but there was a lot of criticism for it. But, you know, this is a guy, the Bushes love baseball, America's pastime. George H.W. Bush was the captain of the Yale baseball team. He was a great fielder, wasn't such a good hitter, but had he been a better hitter, he may well have gone pro. So to actually own a baseball franchise was very much in keeping with the passions of the Bush family.
We're down about 4 minutes, so maybe 2 minutes per question. Yeah. Tell us your research methodology, compressed.
You know, the thing is that I did a lot of research
on this
access
book.
Here. Yeah, but the key was
Unusual
access.
access, right?
Yeah, the key was that the Bushes are famously circumspect. They don't spend time wallowing on the couch. So to get them to be introspective about this relationship was hard, but you had to get the story from the Bushes themselves because they didn't talk during the presidency about their relationship. They don't talk much about their family, about their dynamics. So you had to get it from them. And I went to George H.W. Bush, who was my wife is here. The Bushes were dear friends of my wife's and mine. And George H.W. Bush, I think, just out of pure politeness, said he would do it under the guise that George W. Bush did it too. And I think he said that not thinking that George W. would agree. In fact, I found out later he was very surprised that he did agree. So I went up to Dallas. I knew George W. Bush a little bit, not that well. I know him a whole lot better now. And I was expecting to have to persuade him to do it. And I said, look, Mr. President, you know this story is going to be written. This is too compelling and too unprecedented a story not to have historians write about. And they're going to have to speculate about this relationship. And you've seen the conventional wisdom about this relationship. If you're going to dispel that mythology, it has to come from you. It has to come from the principles. And he said, I thought about it. You're right, the story needs to be told. And I've decided you're the guy to do it. I was so unprepared for that moment that I didn't have a recording device. Oh. And then he starts telling the story. Oh. And I mean, it is fabulous stuff. And I ran, I sprinted out of that office afterward, went down to my car, scribbled the notes that I had in my head from this conversation, which was one of the best I had with him, and then called my wife and said, honey, we got it. But it was, we had about 8 conversations. And I think I really looked forward to them. I kind of missed not, touching base with George W. Bush. We really, I think, enjoyed it. And I think he enjoyed the process of thinking about his father's relationship, so much so that he ended up writing a book called 41 in the process of that. I think in some ways galvanized by these conversations that he and I were having. His book sold maybe a little better than mine, so I'm a little resentful, but grateful to him for trusting me enough to tell his story frankly.
Well, you seem quite trustworthy.
Well, God bless you. Thank you.
Actually,
I have a car to sell you.
The 2016 wild Republican primaries that basically was Trump making fun of the other 15, I think, candidates. Were 17 candidates?
Well, there's 7. We winnowed down, but yes, I think it was at its high, it was 17.
17. Yeah. So I think this may be a fact, but Mark, you could confirm or deny this. I believe that Jeb Bush spent more money per vote than any candidate in history.
That may well be true. I mean,
there was a ton of money,
cash, yeah.
And there was a poor result. But I'm sort of reading now, or instinctively thinking, that the Jeb Bush ascendancy could be in the wings if Trump really flops. I mean, let's say it gets really even crazier, and who knows what's going to happen. I think that there could be a Jeb Bush revival. I don't think Mark agrees with me, so I'll try this on our readers. No, I'm wondering if there could be a Jeb Bush revival as representing what your book talks about: civility, dignity, quiet, communication without a torch, et cetera, et cetera. I'm wondering if is that bizarre thinking, or is
No,
there any...
that's perfectly reasonable thinking. I think that we long for people who are rooted in ideology and have core values that reflect us as an electorate. I think he was pretty stung and pretty surprised by what happened in 2016. I don't know Governor Bush very well, but I don't think he's quite gotten over that. I've heard that from one of his sons. I've heard it from people around him. So I think it would be hard for him to enter back into the political ring, but God knows it would be great to have politicians who believe in something. Yeah.
Well,
What a great conversation.
hit
Thank
zero.
you, David.
Thank you,
thank you so
Mark,
much.
so much.
Thank you all for being here. Thank
Thank you.
Good conversation. Great
Well
moderation.
done. Oh,
Yeah.
boy, you're the best.